Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. We've got a more budget-focused lens for you today, the Sigma 28-70 F2.8 DGDN, in this case for the Sony E-mount, but also available in like an L-mount. And yeah, I guess that's probably it, unless you're from, a happy near future where Canon and Nikon let Sigma just, make lenses for their mounts like they used to. Fingers crossed. Anyway, this is a more compact, more budget-friendly alternative to something like a 24-70 2.8. You do give up a little bit of that zoom range at the wide end in exchange for smaller size and smaller impact on your wallet. And there are, some other things that you do give up as well. For instance, metal construction is traded in for mostly composite, which is just a fancy way of saying plastic. Of course, there's nothing like a aperture ring on here. We do have an AF/MF switch, which is nice because similar lenses from other manufacturers like Tamron sometimes lack those when they go a little bit on the budget side. We do have a fairly nice zoom ring here, although we don't have any kind of lock button to lock it. And we have actually a well-dampened manual focus ring. I'm going to be honest, I like the focus ring on this better than on the Sigma 24-70 2.8 DGDN. This one is smooth, but it's stiff enough, whereas the other one just was a little bit too loose. So it's small in the hand, it's not too big. We've got a pedal-shaped hood here, covering the front element here, which is 67 millimeters in diameter. And I mean, the glass doesn't reach the whole way, but you can use 67 millimeter filters, which are not as expensive as 82 millimeter filters, or at least one would expect. Of course, on the back here, we actually have like a little bit of a rubber gasket. It's so minuscule, like I don't know how much good that would do, frankly, but it might keep out some dust or moisture. Obviously, this is more of a budget lens. More than likely, this is not going to be a fantastic lens for astrophotography, but I've been surprised before. So I haven't seen the samples yet. Let's pop into Lightroom and we'll see what we're dealing with. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we've got some samples from the Sigma 28-70mm F2.8 DGDN contemporary lens. And this is more of a budget everyday zoom for, in this case, Sony E-mount, but also L-mount and perhaps other mounts in the future as well. And I have 4 samples here done at roughly 4 of the major quote-unquote focal lengths that this lens contains. Now, why might you be shooting astrophotography with this lens? Well, this lens being a budget option, chances are, if you're looking at this lens, you don't maybe have thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to spend on, various lenses for special purposes. So you might try to find one lens to give you the ability to do a lot of things, including astrophotography. So let's see if this lens is actually any good, because f2.8 is probably about as slow as you'd ever want to go with astrophotography. These 4 samples here, while they look almost black, are actually 60-second tracked exposures. So please keep that in mind. We are shooting them here with the Sony a7R Mark V. That's Sony's 60 megapixel current high-res camera. And even given that 60-second exposure, at f2.8, it's actually pretty dark. This is maybe partially due to the fact that we're shooting at ISO 320, and the reason for doing such is the fact that this camera is ISO invariant and is a dual gain sensor. So essentially, this particular camera only has 2 real or analog amplification stages, 100 and 320, and every other ISO that you can select on the camera is actually digital amplification, which is basically identical to us coming up here and bumping the exposure. However, if you choose a higher ISO than 320 in camera for this specific camera, what will happen is it will lock that file in at whatever exposure value is equivalent. You won't gain anything as far as noise levels. You won't gain anything as far as detail in the shadows that can be recovered. You won't gain anything as far as image quality. However, you might lock some of your highlights in at a clipped part of the histogram, which means that you will not be able to recover them. So if it was something like a bright galaxy core, or maybe a star forming region in a nebula, or maybe just you're trying to retain star colors in a constellation, you might find that you might clip them and be left with no ability to recover them. If you instead shoot it the lowest base ISO along that same range, in this case 320, and you do it at the same exposure time, at the same f-stop, you're going to find that you're going to maybe have a little bit more highlight detail to work with, and you're not giving anything up. If you want to learn more about that, head over to ferventastronomy.com. There's a link there to a really good article on ISO invariance. You will also find some information on the LighTrack II by Fornax Mounts, which is the tracker that I use to track all of these samples. Fervent Astronomy happens to be Fornax's North American distributor, so if you are curious, take a look. And you will also find these samples at that link, and they'll be available in full RAW to download for you to pixel peep, assess the lens's performance, and help decide if this is the lens for you. As always, these are my copyrighted works, however, so please don't redistribute them online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own, and please don't use them as a basis for your own review or whatnot. Put some effort into getting them. I had to buy the lens, etc. So please respect the purpose for which I'm providing them and do so in good faith. All that being said, we have 4 at these different zoom levels, basically, at these different focal lengths, and they're all f2.8, and they're all quite dark. So what we're going to do is boost the exposure and then take a little look. So off the jump, let's look at 28 millimeters. This is the wider focal length, and it's probably going to be one of the more useful focal lengths, especially if you're looking to do something like Milky Way photography. So right off the bat, now that we have boosted the exposure a little bit, can see a little bit more, we can see that there is vignetting around the edges. Vignetting is to be expected. I don't really detect any measurable loss of contrast in the middle. I don't think that's going to be a major concern here. It's not a f1.2 lens or anything. And if we zoom into the center, we can see a couple of things here. First of all, there's a bit of chromatic aberration, a bit of fringing happening, purple-blue fringing. This can more than likely be easily corrected with one click, but there's not too much bloating on the star, so I don't think that we've got any significant spherical aberration to worry about. If we pop out to the corners, where they are, well, a little less dark here. Here we see we've got some space birds or space jets, and this is completely expected with a zoom lens. This is a manifestation of astigmatism. Some of you might have said to yourself, oh, the coma, not coma. Coma, or chromatic aberration as it's technically known, is something that happens when you'll get a star and it will actually blur out on one end and form a little wedge or delta shape. Coma, chromatic aberration, named after comet tails, coma, so it gives that little comet tail appearance, and that's what you would be looking for with coma. Here, even as we go towards the edges, I'm not seeing coma. I am seeing some distortion in the star shapes due to the astigmatism, but I'm not seeing a fuzzy tail either pointed towards the center of the frame for internal coma or towards the edges for external coma. So there's no coma happening here. There is, however, astigmatism of the tangential and sagittal variety. Tangential astigmatism will appear to stretch a star out along a radius from the center to the edge of the frame. So wherever the star is, it will stretch out along that radius. Essentially, the lens is having trouble getting that light focused into a pinpoint, and it ends up stretching out. The sagittal astigmatism, on the other hand, happens typically at a straight 90 degrees along the tangential axis, but it might often appear to curve one way or the other, or appear at maybe a slightly different angle, but it's always one way or another crossing the T of the tangential astigmatism. It will never fall along that same axis and point towards the dead center or away to the edge as viewed from the center. So in this case, it's pretty classic crossing a T and making a little bit of a seagull in space or jet in space kind of shape. That's to be expected. We look around the edges here, it's a little different shape, but basically the same. Here, same thing in the bottom right-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner. The bottom left-hand corner, the sagittal astigmatism is not as bright, but it is still there. Overall, it's pretty much consistent across the corners there. So I'd say that the lens here is fairly symmetrical across the frame. Of course, there is another thing to worry about as far as edges versus center, and that's field curvature. And while we do have astigmatism making some of the stars look bigger than they otherwise would, I don't see too many stars that I would consider quote unquote out of focus as far as things go. We look in the center, little round little dots. Here they start to take on weird shapes, but they still are fairly defined. They're not blurry, blobby things. So field curvature, where things in the center might be in focus, but things around the edges or corners or in different parts of the frame are out of focus, I don't really see that being a concern, at least here at 28 millimeters. Let's just flip through things here. 28. This is 35. You can see how we're zooming in here towards Ursa Major. Here we're at roughly 50 millimeters. And then here we are at 70 millimeters. I'm cutting off some things here, but that's all right. If we zoom into the center, we'll see that, yeah, we get a little bit of that fringing. We've got mostly round stars, but we can see that there's some loss of symmetry here. So the center might not actually be the proper center. You might have, let's see, the fringing is pointing to the left here, and the fringing is on the right-hand side here. So I'd say somewhere in here is the center. I guess that's pretty much centered, but we are seeing some aberrations here. So getting a little bit of fuzz. That might be a little bit of coma here actually on some of these at 70 millimeters. Here we're getting some defocusing as well. These stars for sure are defocused, and that's not even at the edges. That's sort of in the, I would say, central donut region. And then out towards the edge, yeah, they're getting out of focus even more. So I would say here we've got some field curvature more at 70 millimeters. Also, here at 70 millimeters, we're not experiencing as bad astigmatism. Might be changing the shapes a little bit, but it's not making them as pronounced into those fighter jet shapes. If we go to 50 or 50-ish millimeters here and look in the center, we'll see that things are actually pretty tight. I'm not seeing any of that coma, at least not at this level. Got some fringing still, and things are starting to experience astigmatism. Although this might be the beginnings of a little bit of coma, but if it is, it's not very bad, and it's going to turn into astigmatism before it gets worse. Yeah, here we go. So overall, I can also see here now that we're in the corner, the stars are defocused a little bit more, so some field curvature is coming into play. Although the astigmatism is not as pronounced as it was at the widest 28 millimeter focal length. Here, if we go to 35 millimeters, we can see center of the frame's pretty clean. Come out here, there is that purple fringing on some of the brighter stars. As we go towards the mid frame, there's a teeny bit of hint that there's some coma happening, chromatic aberration. But of course, as we go towards the edges, the astigmatism is going to start to take over, and it's going to turn these stars into weird shapes. I would say that by this point, I don't really see coma necessarily, although there is a hint of it happening here, I would say. So mid-frame, maybe a little bit of coma, but I think that's lost as we go towards the edge, and we return to that astigmatism. And in any case, I don't think the coma is very noticeable. I wouldn't really worry about that. And the astigmatism, where aberrations like this really come into play for me is when they change the reproduction of the corners versus the center or mid-frame. So if you can notice a definite wonkiness happening towards the edges, that might mess things up for you. So if you're doing 28 millimeter like this, for instance, and perhaps you're doing Milky Way, you don't want things to start to warp in the corners or towards the edges and only look clear in the middle. In this regard, this lens isn't actually that bad. I wouldn't say that it's got terrible performance. This is pretty normal and expected, and they're pretty well isolated to more of the corners and edges. And from a normal viewing distance, they don't look that bad. So, you know, I would say as far as a budget option, this is actually giving a pretty good level of performance for astrophotography. The only thing is, of course, it's f2.8. It's not going to be the most effective lens as far as light gathering goes. All that being said, let's pop now into develop. We're going to look at these stars. Of course, our chromatic aberration checkbox will not work on those. We need to defringe them manually, and that works a treat. Profile correction. So when we enable the profile correction, the vignetting is being cleaned up rather well. And if you look across the frame, I would say that the star size, and here we're at 28 millimeters, is pretty good. All things considered, it's fairly consistent. So I would have no qualms shooting at 28 millimeters, even though there is this astigmatism. Don't worry about it. This is how people look at photos. Only people on forums look at photos like this, okay? But this is how regular people experience photography. They're looking at the photo, they're looking at your subject, you know, in this case, such as it is. That's what they're doing. So don't worry too much about that. There is still a little bit of darkness in the corners, and that I feel you could probably boost that out by manually adjusting the vignetting. I don't know that you need to, but you could if you want to. It looks like there's some exposure there still. When we flip this off and on, we see that at the wide angle here, there's definitely some barrel distortion. The center is bowed out towards the viewer. The edges are pushed away. When we enable the correction, it flattens the center away from the viewer and pulls the corners in a little bit towards the viewer. If we scale down here, you can see this is a pretty classic barrel distortion correction. So you are losing a little bit of the frame here, but not very much. If you watch the stars as I flip this off and on, you can see you're not losing any stars right at the top and bottom, but you are losing some in this area at the corners and over here. But overall, not too many. And at this point, you're losing some of the darkest part of the frame anyway, so it's not a huge loss. But you're not really turning your 28 millimeters into like a 34 millimeter or anything like that. Speaking of 35 millimeters, here we are. And again, chromatic aberration. Tried to help it a little bit, didn't go the full way, so we can come down here, do it manually, and if we enable our profile correction, here we're seeing there's some minor barrel distortion. It's flattening the middle a little bit and still pulling the edges out a bit, but we're not losing as much field of view as we were before. We are losing a little bit more at the extreme top and bottoms of the frame, but nothing to really be concerned about. That vignetting here is pretty clean too, so that's a good profile. At 50, same. Remove that chromatic aberration. Yeah, we can fix it with the dropper, no problem. Profile correction. Okay, so here we've now passed into pin cushion distortion. So somewhere in between this 50 millimeter focal length and the 35 we looked, there's probably going to be a fairly flat, fairly undistorted, I should say, frame. So there's going to be a focal length there that might be a sweet spot. It might not have no distortion, but it might have minimal. Here we've crossed from barrel, we're now into pin cushion, which is to say the center, or the photo is like pushed away from the viewer a little bit. The correction pulls it back towards the viewer. And we aren't losing anything in the corners really, or much on the edges. So you're not really, again, losing too much field of view. And at 70, this chromatic aberration doesn't want to go away with the checkbox. You can defringe it manually. And looks like there's a little cyan there, but overall that's totally cromulent. So I wouldn't spend too much time on that. And the profile correction, yeah, again, we have pin cushion that's getting corrected. You're losing a little bit of field of view from the exact edges, but the corners are pretty much staying consistent. And the vignetting, there's still a little bit there, but overall it's pretty well corrected. So as far as a 2.8 zoom lens goes, even though this is one of Sigma's budget lenses, I would say it's actually not too bad. And this is on a 60 megapixel camera, mind you. Like we do have at some focal lengths, field curvature, some we have astigmatism that's worse. We do have a little bit of fringing, but that's easy to correct. The vignetting, easy to correct. Like overall, this looks totally fine. So I would say that this is a lens that is, not perfect by any means, but is doing a decent job as far as a lens goes, especially a zoom lens for doing astrophotography. All right, well, let's jump out of Lightroom and wrap this up. Well, what'd you think? Because that ultimately is the important thing and is the reason I hope that you're here. Is this lens going to do well enough for you for what you aim to do? With this focal range, you are going to pretty much need to do tracking to get any kind of round stars, such as they are. You know what? This lens is one of those lenses where I feel like people who might be watching this video to find out if this lens has the approval might need to just stop and realize the most important thing about astrophotography is that you get out and do it. The lens is the lens. If this is the lens that you can afford, then this is the widest, fastest lens that you have. Go do astrophotography with it. Don't wait for some random guy in a green shirt's approval on the internet. That's not really what astrophotography is all about. It's about the joy of doing and being out there and being out under the stars and getting some shots. And it's totally fine to get shots with a 28-70 zoom as opposed to like a f1.2 prime for, you know, one of the new mounts that's just flawless. This is valid, okay? I'll get off the soapbox, but you know, going into this, we should have all known this isn't going to be the most spectacular astrophotography lens, just being a zoom and being more of a budget zoom. But ultimately, I would use this lens if it was a lens that I had, and I would do so happily. So I hope that information is, if not useful to you, maybe inspiring. I tend towards the soapbox every once in a while, but that's just how I feel about astrophotography. I want people to get out and experience it and do it. And I don't want people to stay in and feel held back because they can only afford this or they bought this one instead of that one. If this is what you got, get out there. Just do it. Anyway, I've been Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. I hope you found this review useful or at least worth watching. And yeah, hopefully we'll catch you in the next one.